Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport, then this is the podcast for you. You can subscribe at iTunes, Spotify, and all major podcast outlets. Today's podcast is a special edition to celebrate the launch of a new book, Race, Ethnicity, and Racism in Sport Coaching. We had the privilege of sitting in on a conversation between the authors, introduced by Stephen Bradbury and hosted by Jim Lusted.
Thank you, everyone, for taking part in this forum and, of course, for your respective excellent contributions to the book. We think together we've produced a really good and important piece of work. The book is the first comprehensive collection of academic work focusing specifically on issues of race, ethnicity, and racism in sport coaching, and we think provides a timely and insightful scholarly contribution to this otherwise marginalised field of study. The book has a significant degree of topicality, certainly in the context of debates around the lack of racial diversity in the sports coaching workforce, and growing calls for the implementation of positive action measures such as the Rooney Rule, not just in the US, but across a range of national and sporting contexts. I think reflecting the expertise and research interests of the authors, the book has been arranged into three thematic sections, addressing the central topics of, firstly, representation and racialized barriers in sports coaching, secondly, racialized identities, diversity, and importantly, intersectionality in sports coaching, and thirdly, formalized racial equality interventions in sports coaching. Now, the book has an international scope, and we have contributions from authors drawn from a relatively diverse range of ethnic and gender backgrounds and situated in 6 countries across 3 continents. And I am delighted to say that we're joined by authors today from each of those 3 continents. So by way of providing some brief introductions, and as far as I can work out, in order of time zones going from west to east, we have with us today, and if you just raise your hand as I say your names, that would be great, so as a kind of way of introducing yourselves to one another. In the US, we have Akila Carter-Francique from San Jose State University. We have Joyce Olushola Ogunrindi, University of Houston, George Cunningham, Texas A&M University, Jeremy Juru, American University Washington College of Law, and Dominic Conricode, formerly of Loughborough University, but now residing in Toronto, Canada. And we will presume Dominic's raising his hand here because he's a dot on my screen at the moment. But in Europe, we have, in England, Sophie Cowell from the University of Chester, Daniel Kilvington, Leeds Beckett University, Jim Lusted, Open University, myself, Steve Bradbury, Loughborough University, and in the Netherlands, Jacco Van Sterkenburg, Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And finally, a special thank you to Brent McDonald from Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia, who has joined us at 5 a.m. Australian time. Thank you very much for your efforts on that score, Brent. It's greatly appreciated. So that's my kind of brief overview and starting point. I'm going to hand back to Jim now to begin the discussion section. Over to you, Jim.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So the purpose of this session really is to bring some of these authors together, some of us together who contributed to the book, to really discuss some of the key themes that have emerged from the book, and they'll be tried to emphasize through the structure of the chapters, to have a chat with each other and to try and share our experiences and our research and our expertise. So the 3 things we're going to cover this evening today are, firstly, we're going to discuss the range of barriers facing minoritized coaches, the multiple barriers, the different contexts, the settings, the experience that people from minoritized backgrounds have in accessing opportunities to sport coaching. The second theme we'll move on to, we'll discuss what's been done to try to tackle and overcome some of these barriers, looking specifically at policies, interventions, and evaluating some of their effectiveness and thinking about what might be done in the future. And then finally, the third theme, we really want to discuss the future research priorities for this area. Where will we go from here? What do we want to focus on as we try and develop this emerging field of study? So we'll kick off with theme one, what the barriers are for minoritized coaches in a sport context. George, could we start with you? I wonder if you might give us a little flavour of your chapter, particularly discussing the sort of multi-level barriers that you wrote about in terms of ways of thinking about these barriers to sports coaching.
Sure, and thanks for including me on the call and including me in the book as well. So here and elsewhere, I've found it useful to think about, as you mentioned, multi-level factors, and I think of it in terms of macro or societal, and then meso, which can include groups or organizations, and then micro, which is more at the individual level. And from a macro perspective, there's I list 3: political climate, stakeholder expectations, and institutional racism. I think probably the last one is the most salient and influencing really all the others. And that's what I think the nice part of multi-level thinking is that the recognition that factors at the macro level can influence decisions organizational leaders make, the paths that people seek in their careers, and vice versa, right? So all the levels interact with one another. But certainly I think institutionalized forms of racism really have a particularly strong influence. At the meso level, a lot of our research has looked at bias in decision making, and bias being the umbrella term for things like stereotypes about who we think can and should be in leadership roles, prejudice, which would be more of the attitudinal form, and then discrimination, which would be more of the behavioral form. And then organizational culture and the diversity climate in the workplace. And then at the micro level, it's sometimes tricky on this because some people can view a micro level explanation as blaming maybe the coach for her or his behaviors or activities, and that's certainly not the case here. And I spent a little bit of time writing about how, the things that happen in our organizations and the things that happen in society influence the decisions we make. They're not made in isolation. So with that caveat, some of the research we have conducted and others have pointed to capital investments and identity that people hold and how that influences how others see them and how suitable they are for leadership roles. And then what organizational psychologists call self-limiting behaviors, but that would include things like if people leave the profession or the organization sooner than others, or if they don't seek a promotion. All of those would fall under self-limiting behaviors, which again are influenced by what we see around us, right? So if I don't see anybody like me in a leadership role, the chances of me applying for that role are probably pretty slim. So they all work together. I could go on and on, but I'm not gonna be that guy. So I'm gonna punch mute and hand it off.
Thanks, George. Hopefully, George, I don't know if you saw, but in our concluding chapter, we drew upon that kind of model, if you like, the multi-level model, to try and bring the book together. And I think it's a really useful model of thinking about. It's important to not neglect, isn't it, each of those levels of analysis. And I think in some ways, a lot of our research has done that because of our perhaps interests or priorities or our focus. So, that's a really fantastic contribution, I think, to helping us think about, how we do that. And we'll come back to that later, I think, when we start thinking about future research. Steve, move on to you, maybe. Steve, did you want to say something about your work and your chapter around the barriers that you've identified in European football in particular?
Yeah, I suppose following on from George and hopefully leading on or leading into what a number of other people are likely to talk about, those multi-leveled and kind of multi-dimensional practices and experiences of access and treatment discrimination that George referred to seem especially apparent in professional football contexts in Europe, and really in two key areas. And certainly within this particular chapter, I wrote about two key areas. Firstly, in relation to networks, and in terms of networks, the kind of unshifting practices of institutional closure embedded in the preference for and kind of almost exclusive reliance on networks rather than qualifications-based mechanisms of coach recruitment, very much who you know rather than what you know. And I think those commonly practiced kind of headhunting approaches in coach recruitment are replicative to some extent of the ways in which players are recruited to clubs, and premised very much on the patronage and kind of personal recommendation of key stakeholders, club owners, chief executives, but also head coaches themselves, who have a significant responsibility for recruiting their assistants, certainly at first team level. The problem here is that such practices kind of override opportunities for a more equitable and transparent and kind of culturally considered approach to recruitment. They sustain patterns of homologous reproduction within the coaching workforce, very much by perhaps unconsciously favouring coaches drawn from within the dominant white social and cultural networks of the football industry. Where I think my work feeds into a number of other authors in this particular collection is in relation to stereotypes. And I think certainly in European football, the historical and continued existence and expression of a whole range of kind of overt, more inferential racisms also, but modes of racialized stereotyping have been a key factor both in coach education and coach employment workplaces. And we see those kind of actions and behaviors in some of the kind of culturally misplaced perceptions, racialized assessments made by key decision makers with regard to minoritized coaches, which very much position them and problematize them as lacking the relevant intellect or attitudinal or leadership skills to coach at the elite level. And of course, such racialized assessments are rarely transferred, if ever, to the review of white coaches who are viewed solely in terms of their vocational self, rather than minoritized coaches who seem to be viewed in terms of this negatively assumed kind of racialized self. So in kind of simple terms, in the minds of key decision makers, for white coach, read the safety option. For black coach, read uncertainty and risk. And so I think those stereotypes and those networks taken together have kind of negative, deleterious impacts on limiting equality of opportunities and experiences and outcomes for minoritized coaches. And I wonder whether that's something that certainly in English football that Dan might be well placed to pick up on.
Yes, thanks for that. I mean, what an answer that was. We've had the first two answers from George and Steve there, and I really do want to read the book now, more than I did before. And also, I think that you focused heavily on the networks there, and you know, Steve, I think you've published more than anybody on the planet about coaching and English football, especially in an English context, and also European context as well. And that kind of mirrors the findings that came out within my chapter as well. So it looked at British Asian coaches' experiences within the game, I think mainly around UEFA B and UEFA A, so going for elite level jobs. And again, some of those findings that we've just talked about resonate with the experiences of the coaches that I interviewed. So there's a culture of whiteness that exists within the game, in the sense that there's qualification courses that you attend, and there's banter, which is another word for overtly racist jokes that are thrown around, which are unchallenged by the coach educators. These are uncomfortable positions to be in, and for some of these coaches, they've thought about walking away from the game. They need that support, they need that experience to be more welcoming and inviting, and those instances to be challenged. The next one is around the institutional nature of racism and how that operates. And there's some stories in my chapter about names. And again, statistically, the research shows if you have an an Asian sounding name, you're less likely to be invited for an interview within Britain, for example. Again, studies have shown that, and studies have shown that across many countries for many, many years. And that's a prime example of how institutionalized forms of racism operate. The next one, as Steve mentioned before, was about networks and this white to white networking that we have that exists within football. Any other industry probably wouldn't get away with it, but football seems to get away with it year after year. The next one is around the stereotyping, and again, that inferential racism that we see, that British Asians, because they are underrepresented on the pitch, they seem to not possess the understanding of the game. They don't have the racialized bodies that possess an understanding of the game. So they face stereotypes and issues there. And the last one I'll say is about role models and that idea that you can't be what you can't see. There are very, very few British Asians at elite level in professional football, and that's been the case for decade after decade. As a result of that, the lack of visibility, that also feeds into coaches in the game who perceive British Asians not to be bothered or interested around football, when that's completely not the case. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. So we're quite British centric. We have been the last few minutes. So I know, Brent, your chapter discusses stereotyping in some ways in Australian context. It's always fascinating to read about how these stereotypes and these kind of racialized forms of prejudice operate so similarly across many different parts of the world. It's quite depressing in a way. Do you want to say a little bit, Brent, speak to your chapter a little bit in terms of following on from Dan and Steve's points?
Oh, look, I'd love to. Thanks for including me this morning. And what a fantastic volume that you've put together. Really interesting. I suppose the way that my colleague and I, Ramon, approached this chapter was looking on more of a structural level of the role of science in the reproduction or the recreation of reified versions of race. And then looking at that to the way then that influences things like the thinking around the natural and the thinking around suitability. Now, in the Australian context, we kind of looked at this as we describe it as kind of a recolonisation process, which seems to be occurring within sports spaces in terms of suitability for task of certain minority populations for certain types of work. And this has certainly increased in the Australian context with the more recent migration of people from the African continent directly to Australia. And so and African into this kind of the black athlete. Now, what I'm interested in, what we're interested in, is how sports science is actually playing a role in the re-emergence of biological race, and quite significantly so since the end of the Human Genome Project in 2003. So there's been this, particularly from North America and in the Australian context as well, a range of science that's been produced to search for the reasons why we have overrepresentation of certain groups in certain sports. And I think this has a major effect because in the Australian context, as a racialised, as a society born on colonisation, where race is the foundation point of the nation, this has it re-triggers a racially primed audience, i.e. a population, to then interpret certain phenomenon. And I think this has a flow-on effect into coaching spaces because the idea of the natural, we've heard about the stereotyping, we've heard about these sorts of things in terms of how they affect on a macro, a meso and the micro level. I think that the re-emergence of this racialised science, which goes unquestioned in sport. Sports science is unquestioned because the evidence is in front of us every time you turn on the television and watch elite sport. So it becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. And then it becomes lived on the level of the agent, whether it be the white coach or whether it be the white athlete or the black athlete or the invisible athlete in the Australian context, which is anyone outside of the white-black binary, which also is a major issue, and that certainly occurs across multiple levels. So whilst barriers wasn't really something we were specifically looking at, we were certainly looking at at the deeper level of this concept of race, Linnaeus's original concept of race from 1758 that continually reappears and is back again, I would suggest, in the sports science space significantly, and has an impact on racialized societies, because the whole thing about race is it's never pulled apart and never dealt with appropriately, and we haven't had a decolonisation process in my country. So those legacies and the impact of those legacies continues on in the coaching space.
That's fine. I mean, I wanted to save the best to last, obviously, Joyce and Akila, in a sense, because I think your chapter is so broad, in a sense. It covers so many areas. Your focus is obviously on college sports and more on gender, the way in which kind of intersectionality needs to be framed right at the center of this debate, which, let's be honest, many of our other chapters don't address that. So having had a chance to kind of listen to what other chapters have said so far around the issue of barriers, what's your sense of where your work fits into these debates?
I'll let Joyce go ahead and start us off in that conversation. Gotta unmute. Unmute, Joyce. There you go.
Oh.
Hey, mute yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening. Hopefully I covered everybody, and I want to thank the editors again for this platform that they've given us. And I think where our chapter helps us to situate the conversation is to take an introspective approach to how we understand and interpret or reinterpret where Black coaches are situated in our field. All the chapters and all the recommendations that are given are needed and necessary, but I think it starts with the coaches, the administrators, and our athletes taking an introspective approach to understanding how our stories are told. And that's what intersectionality helps us understand, is that we're all social beings who engage on these structural, cultural, individual levels of understanding who we are, and we actually inherit a lot of those understandings from the society that we're in. And so, kind of to what Jim said earlier, it's interesting that you're hearing the same stories of people being told across different continents and time zones. So that lets us know that some of these stories may be more inherited than actually representative of the lived experience. So that's what we really wanted to bring out in this chapter, is that, one, when we tell the stories of Black coaches, and we situate it within the college coaching structure here in the U.S., but as we've heard, these same kind of stories continue to, or stereotypes or archetypes apply to Black people, and those stories particularly, unfortunately, are doing more damage than good. Particularly in spaces where there are not a lot of actual Black bodies there to counteract those stories or to tell counter narratives to those stereotypes. And so we really wanted to use this chapter, one, to help us unpack where those stereotypes, archetypes, stories, narratives of Black coaches originate. We also wanted to help our coaches and administrators and athletes understand their own story so that they're able to connect with those of Black coaches as well.
Yeah, so I think, we really borrow from the work of Kimberly Crenshaw when we talk about intersectionality and work to centralize race in this conversation, because oftentimes we can, look at things, which I appreciate, from that macro, that meso, that micro level, but then situating and centering the role of race and its operation in these spaces creates just a slightly different story and in our ability to understand and sort of unpack the lived experiences of that individual on the micro level, looking at the systemic barriers, or even looking at the barriers of the pipeline of coaches coming through the system, and are we even having the ability to be looked at to access, right, into these environments, and then ultimately the experience we have within those environments becomes something that a light is shined on. From a political standpoint, being able to understand some of the challenges between the policies that may be instituted for hiring practices. So we talked about the Rooney Rule with respect to our Black males, but how does that play out for our Black women? What do they have, those particular protections? And so speaking about the sort of the convergence of even looking at Rooney Rule or Patsy Mink from a Title IX perspective, and then some of the practices that have to be unpacked. So while they may not be written in policy, right? So what are some of those cultural practices that happen in those spaces? And then how do those things manifest with regards to representation or lack of representation in those places? And again, I think as Mitty sort of reiterated in our conversation already, if I don't see myself, the likelihood of me seeking out a position to the next level will probably be less, because we're not seeing ourselves in those spaces, nor is anybody sort of affirming that through processes of mentoring, et cetera, networks, right?
So I don't know about you, it's just amazing to hear so many different voices talking to an issue that, you know, we're all passionate about. It's a fantastic experience actually being part of this. Thank you so much for your contribution so far. I think, you know, we've got a really nice little overview there of barriers and the issues facing minoritized coaches in these different contexts. Akila, I mean, you very nicely started talking about the Rooney Rule there, which is a lovely segue into theme 2. So should we move on? We'll have a little chat about these policies in more detail, because a few of our chapters in the book really do focus on this. And I think this is one of the strengths of the book actually is properly starting to discuss and evaluate some of these interventions that are starting to emerge or have been around for a long time. So let's have a chat about that theme 2. What has been done to try and address these barriers and underrepresentations in a coaching context? Jeremy, I'd like to start with you if that's okay, and then perhaps Sophie and Dom, I might come to you shortly to discuss your chapters. But Jeremy, I mean, the Rooney Rule is the place to start, isn't it? Really, when we're talking about this, you know, you're the expert. Can you tell us a little bit about you know, your analysis of the Rooney Rule, where it came from, and you know, in a sense, you know, what your chapter says about the effectiveness or otherwise of it?
Sure, absolutely. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So yeah, so my chapter explores what can be done to break down some of the barriers that we've been talking about. And I approach it from a legal perspective initially and then move beyond it. The idea being that, you know, they say if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you're a lawyer, everything looks like a lawsuit. And I'm trained as a lawyer and I'm around lawyers. I've been a part of the equal employment opportunity movement in the United States. And I found that in this particular context, with respect to professional sports at least, lawsuits haven't been terribly helpful with respect to coaches getting opportunities with professional sports clubs, and therefore diversifying the ranks of coaches for a few reasons. I talk about the fact that it's a very, very small community, the professional sporting community in the United States, and consequently, people are understandably concerned about being a plaintiff in a lawsuit, and therefore being derided or kind of excommunicated from the sport community because they raised a ruckus about issues of discrimination. If you are able to get a plaintiff, then you run into a real serious problem in the American courts, which defer pretty heavily to defendants, employers, when they give their reasons for hiring somebody in any position. There's an idea that we courts shouldn't second guess what an employer feels is important to be able to do a job. if an employer says, well, this person they had that quality, they had that X factor, courts are unlikely to look behind them. And that's particularly the case in sports. Courts are afraid of sports. They don't want to get involved in second guess sporting clubs. And so my chapter is called When the Law Won't Work. And it explores when the law won't work, when lawyers can't use lawsuits to diversify coaching contexts. What can they do? And one initiative that took hold in the National Football League is one that Akila mentioned, which is the Rooney Rule. And the idea behind the Rooney Rule is that for any open head coaching position or general manager position, a club has to interview at least one person of color. The idea being that if that club, the ownership, the decision makers of that club get down and sit and talk with someone else about American football, about the sport, then they are going to have a respect for, a fuller sense of what that someone else, that minority candidate, could do in the position than they otherwise would. And so my chapter explores that approach as a means of breaking down barriers with respect to diversity in coaching in the United States. But it also talks about the weaknesses of the rule, the narrowness of the rule, the possibility that the rule will result in stigmatized interviews or result in sham interviews where the decision maker isn't really contemplating hiring the interviewee, but is just hiring them because the rule says they have to. So I explore the Rooney Rule concept, its strengths, its weaknesses, the traction that it's got in contexts outside of the National Football League in the United States and outside of sport in the United States, and indeed outside of the United States. For example, in the United Kingdom with respect to the English Football League and the FA. I talk about the strengths, weaknesses, and lessons to be learned from the application of the rule.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for setting that up. I mean, the Rooney Rule has left a legacy, hasn't it? I mean, it's one of the most high-profile legal rules and policy interventions around race equality in any sector, let alone sport. So I think you have to bear that in mind. I think, and obviously it seems to have some credibility, some credence in other areas too. It's mentioned quite often, isn't it, in non-sporting settings as well as sporting settings as something to work towards. So Sophie and Dom, your chapters are looking at an early evaluation, if you like, of how these soft ideas of Rooney Rule are being put into the English Football League, which is just the one tier down from the Premier League, but still professional football. And Sophie, you looked at this idea of reflexive regulation, the way in which this kind of voluntary code came in. Do you want to speak a little bit to that? And then Dom, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about the mandatory code, which came in the same league.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And it's great to follow Jeremy as well after all this work on the Rooney Rule in the NFL. So as you said, my chapter looked at the EFL's regulation or their recruitment codes that they've introduced, which is in two parts. Like I said, Dom's going to look at the mandatory aspect, but my chapter looks at the voluntary aspect of this. So it says that clubs can interview at least one Black, Asian or minority ethnic candidate in instances where they run a full recruitment process. So obviously, I think straight away we can pick up kind of issues or potential kind of barriers with that. I think in light of the discussion that we've had around the barriers that minority coaches face in terms of networks and the way that coaches are recruited, I think having the code voluntary at that level, I think it does have some issues when it only applies when full recruitment processes are run. It basically is quite a big loophole for clubs to avoid following that. But yeah, I also took kind of a similar approach to Jeremy in a way by looking at this from the legal perspective. And I think, like Jeremy said as well, I think it's been similar over here as well. There are existing legislation which focuses on, which is quite reactive. It's sort of anti-discrimination legislation. It provides people with a means to kind of bring a lawsuit if they've been discriminated against. It hasn't really done a great deal to promote equality or to promote diversity, and particularly within coaching. I think it's like the issues that Jeremy talked about as well. You don't really want to be that person that has brought a lawsuit. It probably might not help you moving forward in terms of securing a position. So I looked at it from the reflexive regulation angle, like you said. So reflexive regulation basically is a legislative approach where instead of having like a national piece of legislation which says this is what everyone's going to do or this is what you can and can't do, it basically provides the space, the legal space for employers and organisations to develop measures that are kind of suited to their organisations. So positive action within the UK is an example of that. The legislation around positive action is quite vague, it's quite broad. It doesn't even have a legal definition, for example, which can be quite frustrating at times, but it means that there's quite a lot of scope there. And arguably that is a reflexive approach because you're giving employers or organisations the scope to come up with their own solutions. And arguably you could say that's what the EFL has done. They have looked at the problem that they have within their leagues and kind of try to develop their own way of combating that problem with the space that they're permitted. I think obviously it goes without saying the similarities between the EFL's code and the Rooney Rule. There's some argument around whether they've done that or whether they've just looked to introduce a version of the Rooney Rule and thought that in that level it's probably not going to be quite as strict or have the sanctions associated to it. So it's a somewhat watered down version. But my chapter really kind of looks at that regulation and that code from this reflexive approach to see kind of how it fits into that legal framework and how it may have been developed.
I caught myself talking whilst muted. Thanks, Sophie. I mean, your work is really important, and particularly in a UK context, well, you're one of the few people writing in this area, and I think we need more from you, Sophie. So hopefully this might spark some future collaborations. And Dom, just following on from that, really, your chapter, it's great to have two chapters on the similar sort of area, but slightly different. You were looking at the mandatory code.
Yes.
Again, do you want to just speak to say some things you'd like to say about that? What you found and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for organising this. First of all, the editors of the book, and really honoured really to be here on this call today. So yeah, my chapter was written in conjunction with Steve. And we looked at the English Football League mandatory code of coach recruitment. So this is sort of the sister code really to the voluntary code that Sophie mentioned. However, this applies at the youth level of men's professional football in England. So in the youth academies, where ages of players range from about 7 years old to up to about 21 years old. So judging by the name, as you can probably guess, the code is obligatory, really. Clubs, academies are meant to follow this. There's not really the voluntary loopholes, so to speak, that exist in the code that Sophie spoke about. So we examined the operational and attitudinal implementation of this code in youth academies. So talking about the procedural implementation, we found that the code did actually have quite a positive impact in providing more opportunities for Black, Asian, minority ethnic coaches to take part in recruitment processes, first of all, and to have led to some significant gains in increasing the employment of Black, Asian, minority ethnic coaches in academy settings in England. However, perhaps the most significant focus of our chapter was the attitudes of those senior decision-making personnel in academies towards implementing the code. So in respect to the attitudinal implementation of the mandatory code, we describe a race-conscious and a race-neutral approach amongst key decision-making personnel at club academies in their implementation of the mandatory code. So regarding race-conscious approaches, this was amongst senior decision-making personnel that recognised the salience of race, and they recognised the existence of at least some of the racialised inequities embedded within the coach recruitment process at the youth academy level, They valued diversity amongst coaching workforces. It was something they felt offered a variety of benefits to their coaching workforce. And on the whole, they viewed the manager code as a useful policy tool, which they, to be honest, meaningfully engaged with. On the other hand, and these were perhaps more prevalent, more frequent opinions or attitudes, were race-neutral approaches, which downplayed the salience of race, really. There was a widespread lack of recognition of the existence of racialized barriers in coach recruitment processes in youth academies. These senior decision-making personnel, they didn't really value diversity in coaching workforces. It was something seen as secondary, if it mattered at all to them. And this really underpinned a lack of organizational buy-in to the code. And there was merely a symbolic engagement, really, amongst these personnel with the code. And what we argue, really, our chapter was informed by critical race theory and really drew quite heavily on the work of Vanilla Silver. We argue that these race-neutral approaches were particularly prevalent when there was a dominance of liberal ideologies of colourblindness, meritocracy, and race neutrality amongst senior decision-making personnel. So more broadly, these staff often viewed the coach recruitment landscape as inherently fair and free of racial bias. They're often white staff who express these perspectives, also adopted colourblind perspectives, arguing that success in football coaching was often or was solely due to talent, ability, and hard work, really stripped these contexts of their racialized underpinnings, and effectively argued it was individual and cultural deficits on the part of Black, Asian, minority ethnic coaches which underpin their representation rather than these everyday routinized recruitment practices. So yeah, and then people have mentioned this, I think Dan mentioned this, all the sort of culture of whiteness within coach recruitment. We argued this displayed a tendency of powerful white groups in sport to sort of universalize their own experiences as the cultural norm, as if to say, this stuff hasn't affected me, so where's the issue, really? And then on the whole, we argued it wasn't really surprising amongst these senior decision-making personnel that they expressed a resistance towards the code, when for them, there was no issue in underrepresentation or barriers faced by Black, Asian, minority ethnic coaches in the first place. For them, they didn't recognise racism and they didn't see the need for anti-racism, so to speak, in this context. So yeah, and we made various recommendations from this chapter, and I assume hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of those later in the presentation. But yeah, that's about what the chapter looks at, and thanks for letting me explain it.
Oh, thanks, Dom. Yeah, very, very resonant with some work I've done in the past around policies and the reception of policies. And I think we have to be very, very careful of policies just being the answer, don't we? Because quite often these sport organisations, they whack a policy out as a defence mechanism, as a kind of a sense of, look, this is what we're doing, as sort of a performative form of equality and diversity, and we have to be cautious, I think, of those policy initiatives if they're not followed up, and that's what I was interested in your chapter, Joyce and Akila, because you didn't just focus on policy. You talked about other ways of potential interventions we can have. I've got, for example, mentoring and advocacy. Do you want to say one or two things about additional forms of things that can be done and that have been done to try and break down some of these barriers?
Yes, I want to piggyback on what Dom highlighted in his chapter with those predominantly the white coaches and players in these spaces not being able to understand the lived experiences of their racialized counterparts. And that's why I think intersectionality is so important, that in centering everyone's lived experience, and going to your question, Jim, about what these solutions look like, because it really starts with us seeing each other as human, right? And you, as a white person, you had mentors, you have people that look like you. That's a solution, right? You know, that these solutions are not far-fetched, and they're not they don't have to take a lot, particularly on the macro and the interpersonal levels to really create change. And so just looking at intersectionality, we talked about the networking, right? People that look like you, people who can sponsor you, and whether that's telling you about a conference or telling you about a position that's open. We know that access is almost half the battle sometimes, that a lot of these opportunities to coach are not even known because of the lack of networking or mentoring available. And so I'll let Dr. Keela continue, but I really wanted to hone in on what Dom has illuminated so well, that we really need to step back and think about what made me successful as a coach. And those are the solutions are right there.
Yeah, I think, you know, on that same vein, mentoring is, gosh, what I've been pushing throughout everything that I do, because it can just be so impactful to an individual to know that somebody is thinking about me, somebody cares about me, and for mentoring to go beyond this notion of, in order for me to mentor you, I have to look like you, or I have to be the same gender. So really, you know, one of the things that we talk about and encourage is there is value in cross-racial mentoring. There is value in cross-gender mentoring. And again, it's one of those things where you begin to establish the relationship with that individual, understanding that it may start out as mentoring and then it may evolve into eventually serving as a sponsor, as Joyce spoke about, or turning into a champion to say, hey, you know, I'm not at the same institution, but I do know this person, I do know their work, and we need to really consider them to be in that pool. So understanding that, you know, football has that, NFL has that sort of protection of the Rooney Rule, but that is not throughout our respective spaces and places. And so when those policies aren't in place, we have to begin to examine or self-examine our own cultural practices, understand where we are as an individual when it talks about cultural competence, but understand even where we are as it pertains to the culture of our organization and what do we stand for, and being able to sort of reevaluate that process and recognize that, you know, we can make change, but a lot of that is going to have to come within the way that we do our everyday, and taking an opportunity to do, I guess for lack of a better term, a sort of a diversity audit, an understanding of where we are as an organization, and an anti-racist sort of cultural competency space. And there's those tools out there, and there's organizations even outside of sport that work to come in and work with specific athletic organizations and help those individuals do the work once they're ready to make that change.
Joyce, did you want to come in?
Okay.
Did you want to follow up on that, Joyce?
Yes, I also wanted to add, from a policy standpoint, oftentimes we get asked the question, I teach sociology in sport, and, you know, why do we have to have a Rooney Rule? Why do we have to have Title IX? And I think this is the opportunity to turn those questions on its head and say, why don't we have those same type of rules for white men? And then that will help us to start unpacking, you know, some of the things that racialized and gendered individuals face, and why we have to have a policy, but more so, again, going back to how we now think about the solutions to help these individuals.
And just to add, we're in a prime space for it now, especially in the U.S. With the confluence of, you know, between COVID, as we're experiencing globally, and the racial unrest that's taken place, and the Black Lives Matter movement. We're in a space and time where I think some of these walls will come down, where people will be willing to address some of these challenges. And so again, I'm glad and I'm very excited to be a part of this book, because the time is now. I think what each of you all have shared is some best practices that can help these organizations move to a place of, you know, fully inclusive, you know, multicultural organization in the way that they think, do, act, and respond to the change efforts.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, like, you know, this is a really interesting time. It's a really depressing time, but it's fascinating in the sense that, you know, from my perspective, my work on this area, my work for the last 10, 15 years has been to try and convince people that racism still exists, and in sport, you know, and to say, look, there are problems in sport, and this is my evidence to show. And on the one hand, you've got now this opportunity, this space has opened up for everyone to suddenly start being interested in, you know, almost the sociology of race. But at the same time, you've got a much more vocal group of people who are very, very resistant to the existence of racism. So it's almost now become, in the UK at least, quite acceptable to say, you know, white lives matter, for example, and you know, really kind of saying, what about me, you know, and challenging the very existence of racism. So it's a funny time, I think, you know, because it opens up that space for conversation about racism. But equally, I've never felt more in a more of a hostile environment, you know, in terms of talking about racism than I have at this point. So, Steve, I got the feeling you were itching to come in. Did you want to say anything? You've not said anything for a long time.
Yeah, that's highly unusual. But just to kind of, I'm conscious of time really, and just to kind of bring this particular section to a close, to try and summarize, I think, what people have said, and perhaps also offer some of my own assertions here. It seems to me that thus far, and I've kind of picked up on this from what I've read in all of your work and the things you've discussed this today, I'm not going to say this evening, but today, thus far, sport seems to have offered a kind of series of single level or single axis kind of solutions to what are multi-level and multi-dimensional and intersectional kind of problems. And as a result, we shouldn't be surprised it's engendered some kind of mixed outcomes. Because on the one hand, measures to kind of educate and empower minoritized coaches, where there has been evaluation of this, it's shown that it's clearly engendered some kind of key developmental benefits for those coaches. However, simultaneously, it's kind of left the structures and the cultures which underpin racialized inequalities as kind of unchallenged and untouched. It's targeted the individual and not the kind of structural issues. On the other hand, measures such as the Rooney Rule, designed to kind of ensure more equitable processes of coach recruitment, at least as in the case with the Rooney Rule, when supported by a process of monitoring and enforcement and compliance, which of course doesn't exist in the EFL codes, clearly has opened up some previously closed operational practices, but again, simultaneously has left the attitudes of those charged with responsibility for those policies unchecked and unchanged. And so it seems to me, and we've argued this, and I think all of us in different ways have argued this in our respective work in this book and elsewhere, that there needs to be a much more holistic and kind of unified approach to tackling these issues, which feature, I think, three areas. The development and implementation of robust policy interventions. So work here might focus on both recruitment policies and development programs. And I think, as I think it was Akila just mentioned, there needs to be clear policy goals and actions, the collection of baseline data, monitoring and evaluation of kind of progress over time, little of which happens presently, it seems to me. Secondly, there needs to be the development and implementation of education and training programs for key stakeholders. Much of what we started this discussion around was issues around stereotypes and ways of thinking, and we've just come back to it in this part of the discussion. So educational programs for key stakeholders might involve educating people on what constitutes institutional racism, what constitutes racialized stereotyping. It might focus on promoting the benefits of cultural diversity. And that kind of educational work, I think, might also help contextualize the relevance and the applicability of the kind of policy interventions that we want to see. If those who are charged with implementing these policy interventions better understand why they need to exist, they are more likely to implement them. And finally, I think here, and a number of people have touched on this, developing and enhancing networks, social capital and opportunities for minoritized coaches. Might be physical and online kind of networks, might be formal or informal mentoring and advocacy programs. Establishing sport-specific databases or kind of ready lists for elite level minoritized coaches, which can be accessed by elite level sports clubs, who know then that there is this cohort of coaches out there who are ready and able to fill those roles. So taken together, and to pick up on what a number of people have said, all of this work really is designed to challenge and disrupt and dismantle those kind of processes of whiteness as a kind of powerful structural and cultural practice, to challenge the kind of routinized practices, normative arrangements of coach recruitment, but in a much more unified, holistic, coordinated, and kind of well thought out way, not just half a policy here and a half a policy over there, and hopefully somehow it'll all fall together. It won't. It needs to be structured and organised. That is as much as I'm going to say on that topic, Jim. So on to the final section, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious of time, and I think you know, Steve, you've wrapped up a lot of our discussion really nicely. So I wonder if we just have a very short discussion, you know, for anyone who wants to come in. Jacco, you know, you've not had a chance to say anything yet, Jacco. So let's have you to have a chance, but also anyone else, just in terms of speaking to where we go from here. And you know, I think Steve's come up with some really useful recommendations, you know, that we certainly want to think about following up. But what about our research? You know, what about this research field? What should our focus be as we move forward? And I mean, I guess there's no right or wrong answer to that, but you know, where are we going? I don't know, Jacco, do you have any thoughts on, you know, where we want to be going from here, where you plan to go, you know, with some of your research around, you know, sport coaching?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So yeah, what I would like to, you know, to do first of all is invite you all to the Netherlands, and then talk to our football association, because they received quite a lot of money to you know, to challenge racism on different levels, but they seem to have a hard time. I already actually wanted to have Jeremy over. I invited Jeremy, right? But yeah, the COVID-19 crisis, yeah, made it impossible. Steve also, I invited him. So you know, I think it's good to use each other's knowledge on this. But you know what, I want to connect. I want to connect a little bit to what Steve just said, and also Akila before that, and that also relates to my own chapter. You know, I do a lot of work on the media as well, on media, sports media, and Akila said we should also look at our own practices, right? Self-reflection, educational work, which Steve mentioned. What I noticed in the interviews I did with the minority ethnic coaches in the Netherlands, is that they really consider the media stereotypes as a barrier, as an obstacle, right? You know, especially black men being seen as very athletic, naturally athletic, but not good leaders. So it was a barrier to them on the one hand. On the other hand, and let alone that's only men I interviewed. I mean, from the data, we know that minority women, you know, they are nowhere in the leadership position. So that's even a harder, tougher position to be in. But what I also noticed, and that was quite remarkable, is that on the one hand, they said the stereotypes hindered them, they were an obstacle, but half an hour later, in one and the same interview, they themselves used the same stereotypes, being a coach, talking about their players. They said, yeah, of course, I want to, you know, for instance, have that black player on the side because he's fast. So that, to me, that meant that these stereotypes are so, they permeate society to such an extent that kind of everyone seems to use them. So educational work in that respect is important. We know that in particular, yeah, white people in you know, and they are in the leadership positions generally, they in particular tend not to see those stereotypes. They tend not to reflect on them. So there should be educational work. But my interview showed that it's more than only that group that should be, you know, made aware of that. And so that was kind of what my chapter showed me, kind of this relationship between media stereotypes and the leadership positions. So thanks for that. And yeah, it's great to hear all of you after reading all the chapters, you know. So moving on to the other speaker. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, Brent, I mean, you got up at 5 o'clock in the morning for us, so I think you need to have one of the last words. Where's your research taking you, Brent? And you know, what do you think the important areas for you to focus on? I guess perhaps from an Australian context in particular.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting in the Australian context because this meritocracy and then the sort of neoliberal logic that pervades sporting spaces is really evident, and there's a real absence of any sort of frameworks that we've heard discussed in, say, the United States or in English football that apply to the Australian context. And I think the research that we're trying to continue on with is to continue working in the lab, but seeing how like these universities that produce all these experts in these fields now, which is huge. So, you know, you have to have a degree now to become a coach in Australia. It becomes a production line, and when they go into these spaces, then they have to study all these bioscience subjects that reaffirm some of these things. So this intersectionality of how the system works is really difficult to pull apart. I'm really interested in now looking at trying to intervene on sporting organisations to take some of this. Well, how do you affect change? You know, if you've got 40% of your playing base are Pacific Islanders, but you've got no Pacific Island coaches, then there's clearly something not quite right in that space. And of course, this is a very masculinized discourse as well. So, you know, the issue for women in this space is another problem again. And obviously, from the colonial perspective, which is, you know, the Australian context, we have our own contextual issues in terms of, you know, hyperdiversity in places like I live, where over half the population are born. Really lack of diversity elsewhere. My internet keeps on dropping in and out, but yeah, it's been fascinating listening to everyone. I'm glad I got up.
So are we, Brent. Thanks ever so much. It's been really great to have you. I think maybe we're on the last word. I wonder, Jeremy, you know, you've been reading and researching the Rooney Rule and you know, the legal implications of it for many years. I wonder where you think where we're going, but also where you're going in terms of, you know, your interest in the Rooney Rule. You know, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been focusing on this for some time, as all of us have in this realm, and I will say that it, you know, the work is sometimes dispiriting. So, for example, in the Rooney Rule context, when the rule first came into play in 2003, there was one head coach of color and 0 general managers of color in the 32-team National Football League. And over the course of the next 5-7 years, those numbers jumped up to 8-9 head coaches of color, 5-6 general managers of color. And we were plateaued there for a while. And in the last few years, the numbers have dropped back down to roughly where we were in 2003, 2004. And so I think the key, one thing that I'm researching is this concept with respect to the Rooney Rule of 2 in the pool, that the Rooney Rule requires one person of color to be interviewed for these positions. But a lot of research indicates that one person of color really isn't going to move the needle. But if you have 2 people of color being interviewed, or if you use the Rooney Rule concept in a context with respect to gender, 2 women being interviewed for an opportunity, then the likelihood of a person of color or a woman getting the opportunity jumps exponentially. So that's one piece that I've been researching in particular. But I think the bigger point for me is that we all continue our research. That is to say, this can be fatiguing work. Sometimes it feels like I'm knocking my head against rocks, and I imagine maybe for all of us that's the case. but particularly in this moment, with what we see going on in the world right now, our research, the work that we're doing, is as important as ever. So I would just encourage us all to continue pushing forward with the research, with the work, because ultimately, in the end, I do believe it'll pay off.
The apposite words of Jeremy Duru seem as good a place as any to bring this discussion to a close, beyond adding a few additional summary comments as to potential future research priorities. In this respect, each of the contributors to this forum and to the book more broadly have suggested, in one form or another, that future research should focus on the multi-leveled, multi-dimensional and intersectional ways in which racisms and racialized exclusions operate in sports coaching contexts, and should also offer a critical examination of the implementation and effectiveness of interventions designed to address racialized inequalities in these settings. In doing so, research of this kind might focus on how such issues are played out across different national and sporting contexts, and with respect to different and differently minoritized groups. Importantly, such research might seek to prioritize the exploration of intersections of race and gender, and with particular regard to the doubly marginalized experiences of minoritized women. And this latter point is relevant not just for the sports coaching context, but also speaks directly to the white male-dominated environs of sports academia itself, and the disproportionate male-orientated research focus of many race and sports scholars. In this respect, it's the contention here, shared by contributors to the forum and to the book, that future research in this field should do much more to foreground and illuminate the historically subjugated testimonies of minoritized women and men, whose experiences and perspectives have traditionally been excluded from, but which remain subject to, dominant majoritarian narratives on race and racisms in sport and sport coaching. And, relatedly, academic scholars might do much more to acknowledge but also reflect on the ways in which their own racialized and gendered identities and social, cultural and political positionality impact on all aspects of the research endeavor and the process of meaning making and knowledge production. Finally, we reiterate that the contributions to this forum and to the book more broadly are intended to act as an intellectual stimulus to other scholars and practitioners to extend empirical and critical analysis in this important field of study and to embed the principles and practice of equality, diversity and inclusion within sports coaching settings globally. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast.